There have been a number of articles, emails and complaints about parking charge notices being issued in places such as motorway service stations when people are using an electric vehicle waiting to charge it and all the spaces are occupied. They wait for an additional 20 minutes or so before they get a space, and sometimes takes an hour and a half or 2 hours to charge the vehicle. This will undoubtedly take them over what is the allowed period of stay on those services, even though they were waiting to use the services themselves. And a few days later, they've received a parking charge notice through the post because they've overstayed their welcome. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of these articles refer to it as a fine, which the Supreme Court went to great lengths to explain was not a fine and was a fair administrative charge, that being a parking charge notice. Although some of the articles are referring to parking charge notices, but many of them are interchangeably talking about a parking charge notice, which is inherently different. It's inherently an invoice for the breach of contract and the administrative charges that occur as a result. But in any event, if one is acting in the capacity of a consumer and the parking operator is obviously acting in the course of business, then consumer law is going to apply to that contract one way or another, thus meaning if terms are unfair, they are not going to be enforceable. And one might fairly assume that there's an implied term into that contract as a consumer that if you're waiting to use the service, that you're permitted to wait to do so, and that if you are then found to be in breach of the overall stay, that should be okay and excused because you were waiting to use the services. If, taking this as the reverse, there was a term to say that you're not allowed to fully charge your vehicle even though that's what you are there to do because it takes you over the period of stay, question, is that an unfair term? And if so, it's not going to be enforceable. So personally, if I were in this situation and I'd overstayed by just as little as 15 or 20 minutes because I'm waiting to use those services, personally, I would be challenging it on the basis that it's unfair and that there should be a deemed implied term into that contract that I can wait to use those services within a reasonable amount of time. Clearly, if they're not operational and you were sitting there for 3 days, that's a different matter, or even for several hours and you were still waiting there, or there was 100 cars in the queue taking up all of the car parking space, that might be a different matter. But as I often say, these things should come down to common sense. They should be viewed as a very reasonable objective standard, and on a very ordinary and reasonable interpretation of these events, if one is overstaying by 20 minutes because you're waiting to use those services, I think that's perfectly fine, and I think it would be unfair to levy what some are calling a fine, which is probably a parking charge notice against such individuals. So as always, I would appreciate your thoughts and comments in the box below, because these are what ultimately will inform the law, because collective views of society very much should be taken into account when drafting new law, and I for one think that new law should come into play when there is such pressure on using electric vehicles and so few spaces available, resulting in situations such as this one. So in the meantime, I'd appreciate if you like the video and subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.